In this video, I'm going to talk about the evolution of this studio. Now, the reason for this is I was once very, very digital. I basically fitted this studio. This studio was just this system with an Avid S4, and that was it. All these racks, everything that's in here, I didn't have. And I wanted to keep it all about the room. It was all about the room. There was no racks in here. It was very minimal. And that's when I first built this studio. And I went down a very digital route. And the reason for that was that I didn't like I'd gone from an SSL 36 channel with EQs, compressors, all sorts, quite a fair amount of gear in there in my old studio. And it was painstakingly painful to recall all these different settings, even with the SSL's total recall on it. It was still painful. It was a long process to recall mixes. So I wanted to go down this route when I built the Atmos studio of like, right, we're going to fully embrace digital and plugins, and we're going to do everything very much just plugins. And after a week of doing that, I sat there and I was just very much like, this isn't right. It's not the sound. I'd built a new studio to progress with my sound, and the sound had gone backwards. And this was the problem. And it made me realize how important analog processing was. Now, what I then wanted to do was I was like, right, well, in that case, I can't do everything digital. We just can't. It has to have some element of analog in there. Otherwise, our sound just isn't up to par. So what we would do is I would mix in here, and I would mix all in the box using plugins, and then I would give it to Nick for mastering, and he would use his analog mastering chain to add that analog glow. And we then went from it sounding very stale and digital to having this kind of more of a wow factor with the masters. And that took it up a level. And I was like, right, okay. So that got me to the point where I was like, you know what? I need to go back to analog. And annoyingly, I'd sold a lot of that analog equipment and I didn't have it anymore. So I then had to rebuild this studio with all the analog equipment. So I went through multiple changes. I put two racks either side of me, and I built a modest mastering chain, probably cost around 50 to 60,000. And it was a nice mastering chain, but it still wasn't quite there. There was a few bits where what was basically happening was the masters that were done in with Nick on his mastering chain were far superior. They did sound a lot better than my mastering chain. And I then wanted to add to that mastering chain. I then added a lot of gear to that mastering chain where it got to the point where the masters were at the level where I was very, very happy with. Then what I noticed, the next stage in this was that there was the wow factor of what the analog equipment would add to the mix and the master was in the mastering stage. So the mixes still sounded quite digital. They sounded very much digital because the processing was all digital and in the box. And it was only once it got to the mastering stage that we added that wow factor. So I then thought to myself, right, well, then what I want to do is I want to then put analog processing over the mix bus. And if I can get analog processing over the mix bus, I can then add that wow factor into the mixing end. And then I'm adding the analog mastering on after. So then when I deliver the mix back to the clients, there's a little bit more of that wow factor in that mix. So the issue with that is when you're mixing, recalling analog hardware is a pain. It's a proper pain, and recalling it exactly the same every time. So I went down a route of adding a digitally recallable mix bus. Basically, I had at the time, I think I had a West Audio Tube EQ, and I had the West Audio NG bus comp. That gave somewhat of that wow factor. It was adding tubes in, it was adding transformers in, and it did achieve that sound. The next step was that I added when it came out was the Carnaby HE2. Now I'm adding saturation into that mix bus. And I noticed over this whole period of time how clients would react to the mix. And up until that point, you never really got too much of, wow, the mix is unbelievable. Like, you'd always get the mix is good. Yeah, we're happy with the mix. Yeah, lovely. And then when the mastering went on, it was the wow, this is amazing. So there was that wow factor added in the mastering. Once I started adding processing to the mix bus, which was analog, I did start getting that, wow, the mix is amazing. This is the best mix and all this sort of stuff. And that was a recurring thing. So the next step for me was, okay, right, now we need to add all of this equipment. And then gradually over a period of time, I added 40 channels of McDSP. That added a little bit of that analog processing in there. We later went to 88 channels of McDSP. That adds for larger mixes. Then when we added all the West Audio 500 series, I will tell you now that when I deliver a mix back now, not even within one revisions, the mix that goes back is the client comes back 9 out of 10 times. Oh my God, this is incredible. This is unbelievable. Like this, it had that wow factor because now there's 140 channels of analog processing within a mix. The wow factor is there from the get-go. And I know this myself, having gone through this process of going from 100% digital to now 100, well, I say 100% analog. It's not 100% analog. It's still a lot of digital processing in plugins still in these mixes. But it's a case of now saturation, EQ, compression, tape is all analog. All of those elements are analog. Then you've just got little bits of digital processing using things like Soothe, Pro Q4, the Ampex ATR 102, little bits of processing, reverbs as well, do that all in the box. All those little bits of processing stay in the box. But the EQ, saturation, compression, and tape, all analog. And the difference now is night and day. It's unbelievable to me how much difference analog processing makes. And like I say, is I've gone through this process of going 100% digital to, let's say, 100% analog, going from one end to the other. And the difference in sound quality is night and day. It really is. And I'm not just saying this because I own all this gear. I'm saying this because it's the truth and it's the process that I've gone through to understand this. And I've always known, analog is king and all this sort of stuff. But really going through that process of going from digital to analog, it's been highly noticeable for me. And this is the thing, is I would never have gone down this route. I'd never have gone down this route if it wasn't for digitally recallable hardware, because above everything, it has to be logical to use analog hardware when mixing. Because if I had all of this gear and none of it was digitally recallable, it would be impossible to recall that mix. If you get a revision that needs to be done, and you often will with mixing, with mastering you don't get revisions, but with mixing you will get revisions because there's some kind of subjective nature involved in this, where the client will have a say and the client will have a vision on where certain sounds should be sat in the mix, and they will want to put that through to you, and you'll make those changes. If I wasn't using all digitally recallable equipment, it would be painful. I just couldn't do it. Anytime recalling something, it would never recall exactly the same. Having digital recall really makes the most amazing amount of difference. I cannot stress this enough, how much better the sound is now I'm working all analog again. And that wouldn't be possible without digital recall, because as much as I'd love to have all the analog equipment, workflow, when you're working with a service, especially an online service, does have to take almost not center stage, but it has to be thought of. And in order to keep your prices affordable, you have to have the right workflow. Otherwise, if I've got a massive console, for instance, and I've set everything up and I'm doing an online service where I'm doing a mix for someone, ideally I need to leave that mix set up, and I can't physically do that because I'm working from track to track to track. And that's what's great about the digital recall gear, is I can work on a mix and I can almost finish a mix, and then I can jump onto another mix. I can go back to that mix and have a little listen once my ears are kind of reset with it, and then print it off once I'm happy with it. But I can move from mix to mix to mix all the way through the day, going from one track to the other. And then if I want to go back to anything, it just instantly recalls exactly as it was. So it's been massively, like, 2024 for me has been amazing, because it's gone to a point in this studio now where I now feel like I have the perfect studio. It's incredibly great to work in. The workflow is incredible, and I have 95% of the equipment that I want. I'm just waiting for a few pieces to release, and then I can put them in, and then once that's done, I'm pretty much there. But then obviously more gear comes out, and you want that piece of gear and you want that piece of gear. The one key thing in this studio for me is it has to have it has to have digital recall. 100% has to have digital recall. Otherwise it's not going in this studio.